Good afternoon and most welcome to 972 of the Heidegger series. Today I will mention one of those people that was referred to by Susie Froebel. This is H. Clarke. And might be one of those very oldest articles from 1973. And it's about his complexity theory. I mentioned earlier on that he discovered that we learn concepts in a specific order. We don't learn them all by once, and that order is always followed. Let me go through it just shortly. The complexity hypothesis is perhaps of more direct interest to development psycholinguists. Development psycholinguists are those who look at how a child acquires language. But oddly enough, it's very interesting for us as well. Since 1973, we have come to understand that metaphors, words and everything is constructed in a certain way. They have rules to them, whereas before we thought everything was sort of hanging in the air and it was connected by this weird thing called the representational line, an unseen line that everyone believed in until quite recently. Oddly enough, this goes to explain quite a deal how we use our words, and he also writes in the introduction, if we don't know how to use the words, we will use them wrongly. So it has an air of Wittgensteinian deep thinking. It posits that the order of acquisition of English spatial terms is constrained by the rules of application. A rule of application is a condition that must be met before a word can be applied to a perceptual event. Tall, for instance, can only be applied to a dimension only if that dimension is vertical or canonically vertical. Canonically vertical means that I can say that someone is tall even if it's lying down. What we mean by tall is when the person at some instance stand on the ground on earth. And he can be lying down, he can be flying around, he still be tall. And that is very important to understand, that there is an origin, but some expressions we are allowed because of the rules to use more freely, you can say, but that doesn't go for any concept. And one of the most important concepts that it doesn't go for is the very well-used antonym, especially within academia. It's thought that you can use antonyms freely. Edward de Bono pointed that out. Within academia, antonyms are used in a fashion that looks like a child doing things. And there is the perception that you can gain something by doing contradictions or criticism. We know that not to be the case, not at all. Actually, by criticizing, you enforce always the thing you are criticizing, without an exception. And that has to do that the positive term of an antonym is always learned before the negative. And in between the positive there can be other different terms. So I would say that the regular idea is that you can divide the world in two layers, one positive and one negative. And if you do criticism, it will be self-evident that you're criticizing the other thing. This is academia in a nutshell. That is never the case, never ever. And that can be calculated, but it can be proved within language, and it's also something that defies common sense. Very important. And that was one of the reasons Paul the Man got acquitted, thanks to his dear friend Jacques Derrida, who saw in him someone who tried to sort of praise Nazism, which of course led to a diminishing energy in Nazism. And this is how things really works. Criticism would have done the opposite. If you were to criticize Nazism, you can actually make it more forceful. And that's proven so many times, it's beyond doubt at this time, since the negatives do not partake in the same area. By using them in the same area, we misunderstand the fundament of language. And this is one of the things that fractality sort of heals for us. Fractality let us go into a world where antonyms do serve a proper purpose. You can use them and they have an effect. Whereas in academia, it never has an effect. Criticism is always strengthening the thing you are criticizing, because we do not know the complexity hypothesis. We don't know how to use the words. There is a proper time, and there is also a proper place to use a term. And not like my old professor said, you can use any term whenever you want to. I think that was killing off language, and he said, when you are in academia, it doesn't matter what you say. And that rule I learned steady on, and I used it for many years. And we also used it when we made a program to produce academic papers. And up to B level, an automatic program by using special terms but also antonyms could get a G, even though there were no human person present. And that sort of proved what the old professor said. It doesn't matter what you say. It doesn't matter. And it doesn't, because you need to know the rules if your language would mean anything. And academia is at heart, the fundament in academia is not to know the rules. It is saying, human language doesn't have any rules. I can do whatever I want to. You can, Clark would say. But then the things you say doesn't mean anything. That's the price you have to pay. And if you think that is a steady price you won't be able to pay, then you should interest yourself a little bit more to what the reading of H.H. by Clark or Susie Froebel or deconstructionism. The complexity hypothesis is obviously a close cousin of what is called the cumulative complexity hypothesis. And we went through a similar theory of that, which was called the cluster theory. And we did that in Höllerstad, and I don't know exactly which period. I would say somewhere in the 500s. Cluster theory said that every word in the language is dependent on all the combined interaction that word has. I would say complexity hypothesis is slightly different, because it also says that there are certain rules that needs to be followed for a word to have a meaning. So the complexity theory is more, or the cumulative complexity hypothesis or the cluster theory is more of proving that words' meaning comes from the use in the world and the accumulated effect of all other words. Whereas the complexity hypothesis actually show you how to use the word on top of that. But it could be that we need both. We need one, we need the cumulative complexity hypothesis, so to kick the fundament of the old theory away, as to prove the idea of a representational line going from my mouth to some outer world somewhere unknown, like you Everett, that doesn't work. And I think that has to be proven first, not for us, of course, who's listening to this video series, but when we are approaching the public with a book or lectures. And that can be done, I'm quite convinced, with simpler language. It is not that hard to convince people in the end. I actually tried my very first deconstruction. We were talking about psychology the other day, And it was somebody who hadn't studied, who wasn't too interested in those matters. And I just said, speaking about the psychologist that was mentioned in the newspaper, and I said, well, it makes sense that you have to know people if you want to learn how they work. And it doesn't really make sense that you learn how people work from a book. And that was bought directly. It's common sense. And I think the good thing with Clark is that the rules of language never disappears, really. You can break them, but then you pay the price. But in common society, they use always the word according to the rules. Otherwise, talk wouldn't be effective. So we can't undermine language in that manner. Of course, we have slang terms, we have expressions that people don't like. We have things that sounds uncivilized or not too smart, like the Swedish expression ba or bava. It sounds a bit, I don't know, but it still means something. It's still following some rules, and the thing the person wants to express gets expressed. It's not so much about the working of the language as the person himself. But if you break the rules of language, what you say will have no effect. It doesn't matter how much you scream. And that is one of the cases that made me understand the cynicism I met upon before in academia, where people get very tired and they get disillusioned about their own project. And I come to think that the project doesn't have to be given up. It just needs some firm rules, and we need to acquire a natural language once more. Therefore, our words can actually mean something. And I would say meaning is not something that can get lost. It cannot disappear. Just because I misunderstand the rules doesn't mean that the rules disappears. It's a little bit like if I were a stranger to Sweden, I'm coming from some country, maybe Indonesia, and I had no idea about the red and green light, and I would pass when it was red light. I wouldn't understand the rules, and I would break them constantly. But it would not mean that the rules disappear. It's not the same thing. They're two different things. And it would have been a price for me to pay also, possibly. Either a fine from the police, or worst case scenario, something drastic like an accident. So there is a price to be paid if you break the rules. And that price is not measured out by a judge, a court of law, or a linguistic court of law, or anything similar. It happens directly. It comes from the language game, so to speak. And that makes Clark's paper so drastically simplified in one term, because all he says, even if what I say now sounds peculiar and distant, everything that's mentioned in his paper can be explained in a common manner, because everyone knows deep inside how to use the language. Otherwise they wouldn't be alive. Second, and more important, the Brown and Hanlon hypothesis, that's the cumulative complexity hypothesis, makes use of transformations and other constructs internal to linguistic theory itself. In contrast, the present hypothesis, this is the one I mentioned now, the Clark theory, spatial or temporal terms and perceptual events are all part of language. The rules of application in our theory are not simply rules concerning structure internal to the language. They are rules about extension, about meaning. And what he's trying to say here is that the use of a language is to some extent the use of the world or the whole world. The two things cannot be separated in a normal fashion. I think we mentioned that before with this paper that was presented to the government in Japan just before the outbreak of the Second World War. It was a paper composed by Roosevelt. It was Roosevelt and his government that composed the letter to the Japanese government. This was sadly enough translated by a very common Japanese translator. He was cunning in politics, but he was not involved in the actual political decision. That meant that he didn't have all what it needed to write correctly. Only that could be written by the government or the president himself, the full understanding of what they were trying to say. Therefore, when it landed in Tokyo, it sounded more like an ultimatum, that the Japanese government didn't have a choice. That was one of the reasons war was a fact almost immediately. And that could have been avoided if both of the countries were to speak English or both of the countries were to speak Japanese. But there is no other way of avoiding it, bar that someone in the government, for some mad reason, would have spoken perfect Japanese. This is what means that the world always is part of language. The whole use of the language, to cite Wittgenstein, is your life world. You cannot make a complete separation between something you call language and some other thing you call world. The thing goes into each other in a way that makes them part of one of the same patterns. In some cases, it does make sense within the language game to say that currently Hans Johansson is talking. He's not acting much. I don't do much now. But in other senses, on a more fundamental level, it wouldn't make sense to say that my talking, my language here doesn't have any connection to reality. That I just try to transfer meaning to the ones who's listening. Pure meaning without connection to reality, which you yourself have to translate to reality later. That doesn't make sense. The rules of application in this theory are not simply rules concerning structure internal to the language. They are rules about extension. And when I say extension here, I mean something that has a practical purpose in the world, so to speak. Whereas a chair is not only an object, it's something you sit on. It is something for Kalle, who's living in this apartment. He uses it. And it wouldn't make sense to have the chair here otherwise, if you wouldn't have used it. It would be an object of admiration of some sort. And since it's not too nice, it doesn't serve that purpose. Let me go into two concepts here. One is perceptual features, and the other one is his language space. So we talk about perceptual space and language space. We should have a whiteboard here. Maybe I will get back to this subject tomorrow if it's fruitful. Properties of P-space is the next paragraph. Man is inhabitant of a world consisting of objects, people, space and time. And because of his biological makeup, he perceives these objects, people, space and time and their interrelations in a particular way. These are the conditions under which all speakers of any language have learned to speak and to describe the location of objects. But clearly man's physical and biological environment itself places a large number of constraints, a priori constraints, on how he can describe the location of objects. It is these constraints, the properties of P-space, I want to dwell into first. For as we will see, the properties of P-space are strikingly close to the properties of the linguistic system, or L space. The speaker of English actually uses in describing the location of objects in space. One example directly, I can't talk about Calle's jacket as it's floating in thin air. That would not be allowed by language, and it would not be allowed by p-space. So we say that something is on the book, but we usually don't say that the cup is inside the book, and similar things. For something to go into something, that actually requires that thing to be partly empty, at least. You see, there are certain constraints, and this is how reality comes into play. And sorry for the subject sounding so utterly boring, but trust me, this will actually be fruitful in the end. It is a little bit like making a deconstruction on how we use language. And as always when we do deconstruction, we discover or uncover true rules. Rules that cannot be broken. And this sort of implies, I'm exaggerating now just for the point, but this sort of implies that the author and the reader break rules, and deconstruction take them back to the roots, but that's not completely accurate. But think about it in this manner so far, and then we can sort of delve into it deeper later on. There are a number of ways we could describe the physical location with respect to man. If we were physicists or geometers, we would be inclined to see how physical location might be specified in general. Or if we were geologists, then we might be more interested in specifying man's location and environment with respect to certain terrestrial characteristics, e.g. gravity and the perceived flatness of Earth. Or if we were biologists, we might want to emphasize the fact that man has the predictable biological characteristics of a human, and these could enter into how we describe man's p-space. And finally, if we were social psychologists, we might be more interested in how man talks and interacts with other people, and in what roles these other people might have in specifying his p-space, perceptual space. That is, there are many ways of viewing man, and as we will see, each of them adds to our understanding eventually of why at least the English speaker talks about space and time the way he does. Reference points, lines, planes and directions. Be warned, we are going to explain this in a Cartesian way. It doesn't really matter because this also applies to fractal space. The physicist or geometer would ask first about what it means to locate an object in space. In answer, he would probably point out that one object must always be located with respect to other positions in the space, and normally that means with respect to other objects in space. For instance, an object's location can be uniquely defined in three-dimensional space by specifying its distance from each of four other non-coplanar locations in space. This is actually false, but it doesn't matter. It still holds. But this abstract way of specifying location is too clumsy for most purposes. And this has led to the development of reference systems or coordinate systems. I really love how he explains, but what he's saying is, when I talk to other people, it wouldn't have made sense to define things in X, Y, Z. Instead, it makes much more sense to say that the cup is on the book, which is on the table, and the table is in the room. And I go out of the room instead of saying I go from the position X, Y, Z, 1, 2, 4. to be in the position x, y, z, 6, 8, 12. Similar. So we take use of what we are around us. And a good example of that is, for instance, in Spanish, we have 3 definitions for here and there instead of there, instead of having the 2 of English and I think the 2 of Swedish. Yeah, we have 2 in Swedish as well. We only have här or där, but in Spanish we have 3. I can talk about something that's close to me, and I can talk to something that is close to you. But I can also talk about a third thing that is distant to both of us. So you get a 3 division there, whereas in Swedish and English we only have 2. And this is the point he's making here. It's rather obvious, but it actually is very good to make this point now, because once we realize we do never put things into X, Y, Z, we have like almost the possibility of deconstruct what he writes about Cartesian coordinates into fractality. That could actually happen. If I would have been immensely smart, having an intelligence that's not normal, I could actually deconstruct this text and I can understand it fractally. But since I don't have that intelligence, we need, of course, Susie Frober as well. But it would be potentially possible, because no one can lock knowledge in that way. Everything can be deconstructed. It sounds much simpler than it is, but it can potentially be done. It's important to know that, because that also shows what deconstruction is. Just because it's possible doesn't mean that there ever could be a human being that do deconstruction to the utmost, because deconstruction cannot have any limits. It is fractality. It's limitless. Whereas the normal thinking, so to speak, always have pre-made limits, subjective limits, not true limits. Consider how a physicist would specify the location of a point on a straight line, say the x-axis in a Cartesian coordinate system. By one method, he could set up 2 points on this line, say 0 and 1, and then locate the point of interest as 5 units from 0 and 4 units from 1, where the unit is defined as the distance from 0 to 1. This is easier to explain on the whiteboard. In this instance, he has to specify 4 things: 2 reference points and 2 distances, to locate the point of interest. But in a second, more convenient method, the physicist would first define the x-axis as having a single reference point at that origin, or 0, something that also could be called origo, and having positive values in one direction from that reference point and negative values in the other one. Now he can specify his point of interest simply by 5 units in the positive direction from 0, although the 2 methods are exactly equivalent. In fact, one can be translated directly into the other. The second is more convenient, especially in more than one dimension. So you see here, we have already the deconstruction of Cartesian coordinate system, and that is that they are coming from practical things. And that is something Cartesius himself would not have liked. For him, it was part of the universe, an absolute universe that could not be perceived. To say that his Cartesian coordinates could come from the real world would sort of stain them with some ugly substance called reality. This coordinate system is coming from reality. And as you will see later on here, when we come down to man, Clarke sort of deconstruct more and more the Cartesian coordinates, so they become more and more, well, you can call them humane, but I would say they become more rule following, because The simple coordinate system doesn't give a lot of rules. In the simple coordinate system, the Cartesian coordinate system, everything is allowed. Whereas you couldn't put, for instance, one point here being a chair, and then in the next level you could have a car, because the car would have break in the chair. So we don't have to care about reality in Cartesian coordinate system. And that can give the illusion, possible illusion, that a reality doesn't exist. Something I think Cartesius had as an idea. Symmetries of perceptual space. This is most interesting. Now we're going halfway into reality. Because in Cartesian space, everything is symmetrical. If I go 5 points to the left of the origo, the 0 point, then I go 5 points to the right of the origo, I come back to the same point. This is not necessarily the case in the real world. Real world is different, more complex. It could be, if I go 5 steps that way, there's a cliff and I never come back alive again. I like this. The external organs of the body are approximately symmetrical left and right in a vertical plane running through the center of the body. The left eye is matched by the right one, the left ear by the right one, the left arm by the right one, and so on. There are no other lines or planes of symmetry in the body. So man's p-space contains only one natural plane of symmetry, the vertical plane separating left and right. In particular, man has a bilaterally symmetrical perceptual apparatus, including most prominently eyes for seeing, ears for hearing, nose for smelling, mouth for tasting, lips, hands, fingers and face for sensitive touching. This apparatus makes perception itself bilaterally symmetrical, further helping to define a plane of symmetry through the length of the body separating left and right. Well, let's get to the asymmetry. Another property of all these senses is that they are more sensitive to stimulation in front of the body. At least sensitive to stimulation in the back of the body. The ears, they're actually pointing forward. Can you see that? The perceptual apparatus has a sort of an asymmetry built in. The eyes mainly pointing forwards. I can see a little bit back, but if I took my hand there, I can't see it anymore. The taste and the nose is also situated in that direction. So there is an asymmetry. And you see, we are already sort of step by step leaving the Cartesian coordinates. You can see where this is leading in the end. So he starts out with the Cartesian coordinates and then he puts in what he calls the perceptual plane and then the linguistic plane. And in these planes, reality step by step is coming back again. And I like this pedagogy. It's easy to understand. And I think this is how you have to do this understanding step by step, because if you do as I did at home when I was a couple hours ago, I jumped to page 54, I didn't understand anything. So this needs, in some ways, a little bit similar to the writings of Allan Emrén, where he said this needs to be in place before you go to the next level. I will try still to take away some of the material here, so we can jump and then I can try to explain a bit more carefully later. These facts of perception also suggest how we could assign positive and negative values to the directions away from the two planes of asymmetry. First, since everything in front of the vertical plane is easily perceptible, and everything behind it is not. The forward direction can be considered a positive perceptual direction, and the backward the negative one, where the positive is taken in its natural sense to mean the presence of something, and the negative the absence. Why is that? Well, it's very simple, because I can't perceive anything behind my back. Well, not much anyway. So we naturally get two orders of perceptual terms. One negative, which is sort of suggesting absence, lack of perception, and one positive that suggests that perception is coming in. How can I explain this? Well, going out of, as I do now when I leave this room, this is more complex because it takes in a negative, the absence of the room. Where I go into the room come into existence. And we always learn the second one first. There is no exception to that rule. No language on earth follows any other rule. And these are fundamental perceptual rules that are always followed. Not because some judge has said so, not because there is some sort of convention going on here, that we say that for a manner of etiquette. No, this actually comes from the asymmetry we have in our bodies, that all our perception is in front of us. That means that all existence is also in front of us. And this is also the stepwise manner how complexities are arranged. Another thing here we can add, which adds some complexity, is that the ground, everything above ground level is perceptible, nothing below is, which makes upward naturally positive and downward is naturally negative. And this is also true, downward is much harder to understand for kids. It takes a lot longer time. It takes months actually to understand downward. So they are not similar. We as adults, we think, downward is just a negation of upwards. It's not. There is a strict asymmetry in the universe. There are rules to be followed. And there are a price to be paid if you don't follow those. That is not to understand. Another biological characteristic of man is his bipedal stance. When man is talking or walking, or in general where he is alert, in the optimal position to receive other objects visually, auditorily, tactually, he will normally be upright. This is very important. It sounds like something self-obvious, but our whole language is based on uprightness. It's not based on lying down, because our perception is incredibly different while lying down. And this is important to understand later on. One of those things that sounds absolutely redundant or too obvious to be noticed, but it's important. And you will later see this normal rule is always broken, for instance, within academia, perceptually, always. There is a huge breakage with things that are impossible to break. They cannot be broken. He calls this man's canonical position. It's a neologism of Clarke, of course, since it is the position from which he carries out the most important activities. Let me also here sort of make a reference to Lakoff-Johnson. To understand abstract concept, we need to understand they are all formed while we are standing. That means while lying down you can't understand abstract levels at the same level. You have to be standing. There is no, what can you say, you can't skip away from reality in that way. You need to be standing to understand them. Mm-hmm. At least you need to be upright, let's say, some fashion. And I would add to this, because balanced proprioception comes into play. And that means to understand the most difficult words and the most complexities. If you go a little bit above normal understanding, if there is such a thing, I don't know, you need to be balanced as well to understand. Otherwise you cannot understand. And this is not because of some law, some rule, it's because how reality is constructed. And this is why I usually say that apeiron is limits, it's laws, it's rules. Rules we don't want to apply to. We think we can avoid them. We think somehow we could be the exception, in an unconscious level, of course, but still. The final biological fact to be discussed is that man characteristically moves in a forward direction. That is, he walks in the direction he faces, not to the side or backward, for he moves in the direction over which he has optimal perceptual regard. So we can also define a front and back dimension in man's biological makeup, simply from the characteristics direction in which he moves. And from these considerations forward is again the positive value on the dimension and the backward negative, since movement is normal in the forward direction and abnormal in the backward direction. And this is also incredibly important. This is actually connected to direction in F.M. Alexander's case. And I think one of the reasons it's so hard for us to understand direction is that we think all directions are sort of have the same value, or you can come back to the same position if you go 5 steps that way, you can come back that way. As symmetry rules, there is only one direction. And that direction is forward and up. There cannot be any other direction. And even the idea of the Cartesian coordinates in our reality will actually cause you to have less directionality. And this is why I said this paper deconstructs itself. This is why I said it doesn't matter if we firmly establish the Cartesian coordinate system in the beginning. What happens here is a marvelous deconstruction of those things. And it doesn't take the form of a criticism, because that would kill the whole thing. Criticism would be the worst thing he could do. It would be even worse than affirm the Cartesian coordinates. He does something even better. He brings Cartesian coordinates to reality. And they can stay Cartesian coordinates, but we realize that we are situated in a real place. To summarize briefly, the biologist would assert that man's p-space contains 3 natural reference planes. The vertical plane separating left and right is symmetrically biologically, so that positive and negative values cannot be attached to the left and right directions in an appropriate way. The vertical plane separating front and back, this plane, in contrast, is biologically asymmetrical, with frontward positive and backward negative. And ground level, the third reference plane is asymmetric in the upward positive and downward negative. Biological vertical and ground level are even more convenient as reference planes in p-space, since when man is in canonical position, they coincide exactly with the geological, vertical and ground level. And I think that could be one of the reasons we always start with Tadasana for the upright yoga practice. It is very good to sort of both mentally, spiritually and bodily reaffirm that every time we start a yoga practice in the vertical plane at least. And there are other good reasons to stand before we do something. I remember now the ceremonious opening of the parliament, or the diet, if you call that in English. And that was that everybody stood up in the parliament. Everyone, even the king. And the reason for that is that we need to establish the proper directions before we venture in to do something. For if we don't do that, if we would have directly go from a lion position upward or something similar, or go directly into action without establishing the upward and frontward proper direction, we would be lost in some ways. And that standing position is obvious in many cultures, and I think the Cartesian coordinates has taken that away, but it cannot be lost, because we human beings are still frontward directed, and we still walk in that direction where our eyes, our ears, our mouth, our nose is. It doesn't matter if I walk backwards, our language, my thinking will still be frontwards. And that is important to remember. The different directions are not equal, never ever in reality. Let's go to the L space, that's the language space. This chapter on page 36 in his paper is called General Properties of L space. Probably the most obvious property of English adjectives and prepositions is that they require the notion of point of reference, following exactly on the definitions of point of reference from the previous discussion of p-space. Consider the prepositions above and below. The sentence John is above Mary is a statement of John's position with respect to Mary's position. Her location is taken as the point of reference.
Vai her. Okay, above.
The same holds for all propositions in English. In each case, the object of the proposition serves as a reference location, either a point, a line, or a plane, for locating other objects. What is less obvious is that the spatial adjectives also require the notion point of reference. In fact, each adjective has 2 points of reference. Consider the adjectives high and low. To say the balloon is high or low is really to say the balloon is high or low off the ground. Implicit in such simple statement is a 0 point, an origin, the point of reference from which all measurement is taken. High and low happen to have a particular reference plane, ground level, unless some other reference plane is mentioned explicitly. The origin of or 0 point could be called primary point of reference. Adjectives also have a secondary point of reference. High and low, to continue the example, both refer to the height off the ground, but high indicates a distance that surpasses some implied standard. And low actually indicates a distance that fails to meet that standard. This standard depends very strongly on what exactly is being measured. As many linguists have pointed out, for one would describe a balloon as high in a room when it is perhaps 6 feet high, but in a large auditorium, perhaps only when it was 10 to 20 feet high. The main point here is that high has two implicit reference points: ground level, the primary one, and some standard height, the secondary one.
Do you remember that when we discussed with Allan the thing that you put something above a line, like mathematicians do, and mathematicians would say that the thing above the line is exactly equal to the thing below the line, but this is not so in ordinary language.
No, it seemed to imply that, yes.
So that I think this is very useful for me personally, because I'm dealing with such an issue.
Yes, and it also implies that high is before low. Low is more difficult, is more complex. I think we usually think of the things being very equal. They are equal to a certain measure, but yes, this is why it's so interesting, even if it starts out so trivial. The balloon is high may therefore be paraphrased as the balloon is above some standard height from the ground level. Because of these double points of reference, adjectives are more complex than they first appear. And when I read this now, I've been thinking about that very superficially many years ago, but now I realize there is a point to it. High doesn't have the same connotation as low. And it also has a connotation depending on what you're talking about. This is like sort of reality slips into the adjectives. And this is why I call this deconstruction, because all of a sudden it is very important what you're talking about. So in a way, reality comes seeping in, and all of a sudden you start realizing, oh my God, reality never left the place. We cannot talk in thin air without a reference. Actually, reference is like sort of a pair of crutches to use when you don't understand language. But that's a level-like thing. Yes.
No, you have this biblical reference, man is the head of the woman, so of course the higher thing is above. And but in mathematics, let's say that you want to divide, say, 50 with 5 or whatever. So in one way, since so mathematics would say that 15 is superior because it's, no, excuse me, they are equal, absolutely equal, according to Allan. 50 divided by 3. It depends. Okay, it depends on context.
Depends
on context, but in okay, it's a complete issue. I will not.
It's. I think on the first take, mathematics is a little bit like Clark said in the beginning, like the Cartesian coordinates. They seem to that and that are the same thing, and that in the same thing. And mathematics is similar, but mathematics can actually, I'm quite certain, be deconstructed as well. And you could understand, and I think this could be something that Ashish implied. I really never understood that, to be honest, to 100%. But remember when he talked about cardinal numbers and ordinal numbers,
absolutely,
that they are not strictly the same. I understood it to a certain level. And I had great hopes in this, because there are other titles in Susie Frobo's book that are even more advanced. I started with the simplest one, which I think is the rather best way to start. Let's continue a little bit more here. Because of these double points of reference, adjectives are more complex than the first appear. John is in Mary's positive perceptual field. That is interesting. So from the viewpoint of Mary, John is in this area. She could see her. And Mary is also in John's. If John and Mary were side by side, or back to back, or back to front, or in any other position, these conditions would no longer be optimal. You wouldn't be able to say that anymore. If you not were a third person situated somewhere else, and you could still visually see them side by side in some way. This face-to-face situation is what I would like to refer to for convenience as the canonical encounter. Canonical in this sense, I think it means the ideal circumstance, but not always the real one. As we will see, the canonical encounter as another basic property of man's P-space has some very important consequences in language. It is also of interest to note how movement occurs in man's social surroundings. First, other people and objects can move into John's field of view. In doing so, they must first be out of view. And this is very important. Then come from the distance and finally approach his position. Characteristically, if the approaching object is another person, say Mary, she will approach in his forward, positive field of vision, walking forward, facing him. The final position will be the canonical encounter. Second, John would move and approach other people and objects which are standing still. These objects will at first be out of his sight and then would come into view in his positive field of vision. He is walking forward, and finally he would be in a canonical encounter with that object or person. The point to be made from this observation is simply that potential objects to be described come in and out of John's field of vision in a characteristic manner. They enter the field toward John and leave the field away from him. Now I will continue this when I have a whiteboard, because that is absolutely necessary, because it's starting to getting too complicated just to tell you what.
58 minutes by now.
You kidding?
Yes, I'm not kidding. 58, so you have to
Okay,
run up.
I say thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye from now.
Thank you.